This is the HX Collective Self Channel, where we explore the relationship we have with ourselves. In today's conversation with my guest, Ali Schroer, they reflect on the journey of self discovery and the impact these journeys have on the human experience. The HX Collective explores the human experience through three main channels of life: work, relationships, and self. With raw, authentic conversations, the podcast investigates how challenges can become powerful teachers, leading to personal growth and deeper connections. Rooted in humanity-centered design, each episode reflects a commitment to doing good and doing well, featuring diverse voices and generational perspectives. Expect gripping stories of struggle and success, with thought-provoking discussions and concrete tools and tactics that encourage you to rethink your relationship with distress, helping you to establish your full human experience. This is the HX Collective Channel.
So many fantastic insights that you've shared, Ali, around how to look at elevating human flourishing through the lens of work. We've had a chance to talk about what that means in relationships that are relationships even outside of work. The last conversation that I love to get your perspective on is how we think about elevating the human experience or human flourishing with ourselves. Self-care certainly is a term that is being widely utilized and sometimes misunderstood. But like many of the other things you've shared, it also can take on a very customized or unique piece of experience based on how one does take care of themselves. Why do you think right now we need to be really thinking about this idea of having a positive human experience when we think about the relationship with self?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question, Deb. And I think it so ties into the other things that we've talked about, is that if we want to be flourishing professionally, we have to take care of ourselves. If we want to be flourishing with our interpersonal relationships, with our partnerships, with our children, we have to be flourishing ourselves. And so why is it critical? Is because the other parts of you will not flourish if you're not taking care of yourself. And that's that whole idea that you just said of self-care. But I think about it, and sometimes I describe it like a star. And if you picture a star and like the 5 points, that the core of a star is called the stellar core. And that is actually the hottest part of that star. And so our stellar core is really self. And if we want any of our branches or any of our star points, however you want to describe it to yourself, to flourish and do well, our stellar core has to be running hot and it has to be working well. And in space, that's the only way a star shines. And so if we want to shine, we have to be taking care of ourselves. So it's really critical to certainly our own mental health clinically when we think about warding off depression and anxiety and some of these things that people struggle with. But it's also critical to literally every other facet of how we show up and who we are in the world.
Well, there's an adage that says you cannot give away what you don't possess yourself. So when I hear you talk about the stellar core, that makes so much sense to me. When you examine people who are putting a priority with self, or they're engaging in things to keep that stellar core running hot,
Mm-hmm.
what would you say are the differences between people who acknowledge and are doing that well relative to those that are still in the burnout mode, or just, trying, at a depleted level? Sense of, the contrast or ways that we could be thinking about it when we think about our own self-care.
Absolutely. Yeah. The first piece that I usually talk about is that I would love for people to have that core running hot, right? That really feeling good, is that they have soul filling activities. And that is how I describe to myself, to friends, to colleagues, to anybody that I work with. If you want to talk about your own flourishing and warding off mental health challenges, supporting your well-being, coping skills, all of those things combined, it's what fills your soul. And I actually have a workshop on the recipe of success. And I talk about what is your personal recipe for success. That if I am going to make, my own recipe, I better be cooking what I want to cook. Because if I make filet mignon and the whole time I wanted cake, my filet mignon may be beautiful and wonderful and taste good to everybody else. But guess what? It's not what I want to be living. It's not my soul-filling activities. It's not my journey and my recipe. The whole time I wanted cake. I'm still going to end up miserable, even if I cooked it to perfection. And so we have to think about what is your own recipe for coming up with those soul-filling activities. For me, mine is outside. Being outside. I could live 2 feet away is outside. And if I could just stand out there all day, I would, because that helps me so much to fill my soul and to help me flourish, even if I'm facing hard things. For some people, it is, being around animals, it's being around family, it's exercise, it's meditation. There's a million different things, which is why when we talk about coping skills and self-care, there's lists, right? If you Google self-care, you're going to come up with like 400 different lists because they're listing soul-filling things. And only you can define what is soul-filling. So number one, that's what I would come to, is asking yourself. Sometimes it takes a few minutes to close your eyes and when it's quiet around you and just say, like, what fills my soul? And see what comes up. That's where I'd start.
Well, and what I think is embedded within that is the sense of it's an action. It isn't just a cerebral, it's sort of in the space of the doing. I've heard many professionals like you talk about where the momentum, the moving, opposite to emotion, action. If I want to stay in bed and don't want to get up,
Yeah.
but I force myself. Can you talk a little bit about that as a form of self-care? Because when I think about soul-filling activities, I'm really keying in on activity, action.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about that for self-care?
Sure. Yeah. So clinically, when we think about doing kind of that opposite action, if you will, to get ourselves motivated or moving. So when we think about like clinical depression, for example, what we tend to see is that those people, things that they used to love in life or that used to bring them joy, they used to be soul-filling activities, no longer are. And so then how do we get out of that rut? How do we kind of shift back into flourishing? And what clinically we would kind of prescribe, if you will, to do would be to try to find a way to motivate yourself. Maybe you have to recruit others in that process. Maybe it's with therapy and with, some guidance and professional support, but we're looking at how can you do the things that you truly don't feel like doing. And that's kind of the 101 basis is if you feel like staying in bed all day, we are going to tell you to get out of bed. If you don't feel like you want to shower, we are going to tell you that you should shower every day. Right? And finding that motivation, that's that clinical piece that is a little bit more challenging than how I'm kind of posing it and making it out to be, right? It's not easy to do that. But that is kind of the modality or the treatment of how we want to stay afloat. And then once we learn that and build that action plan for ourselves, then we can just kind of copy and paste. And the really interesting thing is that when people have that awareness for themselves, I'm no exception, I'm a human, right? So when I struggle or I'm having a hard time or life gets insane or something happens in my own personal world, I have to recognize my signs that say you are no longer flourishing. You need to go back to your soul-filling activities too. And so I will notice that, I will become more irritable or I don't sleep as well or I'm like antsy and I feel like I have to clean all the time, right? Like I have to notice my own triggers and say like, gosh, I feel off kilter. I feel like something's not going well. How do I get back to my own flourishing? How do I get back to my own, like those activities and those joy-filling pieces of myself? I recognize, I have awareness about those things. I do kind of the opposite action to keep myself motivated and keep myself going in that direction. And then I build those into my weekly or monthly practice.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the construct of struggling because I have had some recent awareness about this idea of suffering, how that is so critical and so essential to a flourishing human experience. And I would used to see suffering as sort of on one end of a continuum and joy, fulfillment on the other end. And I've recently started to see how the two things actually are in a circle or touch.
They're in a circle.
They're in a circle. So I think it would be really interesting to have you share your perspective on how we should have a relationship with our suffering in the space of elevating our human experience.
Suffering is challenging by the nature of the word, certainly, and certainly by the experience as well. Yes. So when I think about suffering, even for myself, I think about how can I suffer well? And that feels kind of like counter in some ways, I think. But if we do come back to what you were saying, that they're so close and they're so touching, I think about it like a circle and that they really are love and hate, same way. Usually we have a yin and a yang. Okay. And so if we're doing really well, we're flourishing and we're suffering. If we say that those are at odds, they do tend to touch. And so no matter kind of which way you spin it, they're very, very close in relationship. And what's interesting about that is depending on the angle and depending on the way that you're approaching it around that circle is you could hit one or the other. So if we think about a difficult example, right? Let's say it's a death of a loved one. Certainly there is probably suffering in that. And there may be joy in that too. There's a lot of mixed emotions of like, maybe it was time. Maybe it's going to put them out of pain. Maybe we're ready for that person was ready for that. And so I want to celebrate that. And I'm also experiencing loss and grief and sadness and struggle. And so how can I suffer and how can I still feel these other feelings? And so one of the things that I will say to myself or to others is that certainly, first and foremost, you are allowed to suffer. That suffering is a human emotion that happens to lots of people. And so understanding that and allowing yourself that permission to not feel guilt and shame about suffering, I think is really critical to learning how to suffer well. Because if we suffer with the guilt and shame kind of complexities on top of it, we end up staying and really getting low, and that hurts that experience. But if we can say like, I am allowed to feel really yuck today, and this was really hard, and I am allowed to have that, and I don't need to feel badly that I don't want to go to the event tonight because I'm suffering. Great, right? Allow yourself the space for some of that is allowing yourself to suffer well. And so when we are able to do some of those kind of those pieces, and I want to say those even somewhat basic pieces of just allowance and acknowledgement of that feeling, then we start to kind of move it over into, I can get through this. It feels less hopeless. It feels more hopeful. It feels more, I don't know. I don't know how else to describe it. I would just say it feels more doable, maybe, when we're struggling.
Well, and what I'm taking away from what you're saying, first of all, I'm glad you brought up the concept of hope, because I think so much of our self-care is that when we get to that place of despair or hopelessness, and how that can be a part of the acknowledgement that we're struggling or suffering in a way, and then having the confidence that it can improve, that it won't always be like that. I'm also fully aware that sometimes when we have hope around scenarios, sometimes we'll hold on to things so long and we don't have the courage to call it.
Yeah.
So, in some instances, suffering can be a great teacher. It
Yeah.
can give you the courage to maybe put the hope that it's going to change or get better so that you can take an action that really is in the name of taking care of yourself. Any thoughts that you can share about, what it looks like to have the courage to acknowledge that, the pain you're in, the suffering is maybe trying to teach you something? Any sense about that?
I think that's really hard. I think sometimes that comes like after the fact, right? When we're in the middle of a struggle, sometimes I even use this analogy of like going back to a boat, but that if you're in a boat and you have a hole in your boat and you're bailing out water, you don't have really the chance or the awareness to be like, oh my goodness, I wonder what this is teaching me. Like, gosh, look how resilient I am. No, you're just bailing out water and you're like, I have got to make it to the shore, right? Like you don't have a chance to think or process. And so it's when you get to the shore and that experience or that traumatic event or whatever it is, that loss is over, that then you go, well, that was crazy, right? That was bananas. And then you start to say, how did I do that? I can't believe I did that. That was pretty impressive, right? And so then we're able to kind of give ourselves kudos and to see it as a way of, I didn't know I had that resiliency and that grit and that ability and capacity to face those hard things. I honestly thought that was going to kill me. When the shark took a bite out of my boat, I thought I was a goner. Like I really thought it was going to end me, right? Yeah. And when we get to the other side is when we can acknowledge and feel that. I think the challenge is that when we're in it, it sometimes feels like we're sinking. And unless you are more enlightened than I am and more enlightened than most, then you can like have that reflective moment and go, this must be teaching me something. This is good for me to struggle and to challenge. And even if we say those things, it may not like actually ring true until we're safe psychologically on kind of the other side of those events.
I am so glad that we are wrapping up the self conversation with that point. I'm having an aha right now in what you just said, that a form of self care is the ability to be reflective,
Mhm.
and in the space of really giving yourself the kudos and the credit for withstanding the shark attack, and just that sense of like, wow, that was really hard. And
Mhm.
I can almost appreciate now that as a form of growth and learning,
Yes.
so that we can flourish. That having a capacity to maybe see how far we have come, or taking a moment to just say, "Wow,
Mhm.
that really was hard," and I did find a way through it.
Mhm.
Be a strong sense of motivation, and maybe give you a different relationship with what that suffering meant,
Absolutely.
how it could teach you something. That's
Absolutely.
So, Ali, as we are wrapping up our initial conversation and our united allyship in human experience and in the HX Collective, more opportunities I know will arise. So, as we wrap for today, as you think about elevating the human experience at work, in relationships, and self, any closing thoughts or advice to the folks that are listening on how and why they should be prioritizing the human experience at this time?
I think the only closing thought that I would have is just that they are so integrated, and that even though today in our conversation we've kind of parceled out three different avenues and how impactful they can be in those three ways, I think that is a wonderful kind of frame up to think about it in different kind of capacities, but also that really it comes back to we are one being and we have parts of ourselves, and those are all just different parts. And so, if we want to be kind of whole, if we want to be a united human and have that whole human flourishing experience, I would think about it more like the star, or I would think about it more kind of as an integrated approach of how do I help support different facets at different times of my life so that I can be flourishing and feel well and have, kind of that well-being overall that I'm really looking for.
That's great. Well, I appreciate the takeaways that you've given me today, and I know all that are listening, and I can't wait for our next conversation. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. If today's conversation sparked something in you, we hope you'll carry it forward with curiosity, compassion, and courage. Subscribe to the show, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who needs it. Until next time, keep exploring what it means to be fully human.